In the shadow of the towering minarets of Constantinople, behind the marble walls of the Sultan's palace, a horror was unfolding that would make even the most hardened Ottoman soldiers turn away in disgust. What happened to the Christian nuns captured during the Ottoman conquests wasn't just religious persecution. It was a systematic campaign of spiritual and physical destruction, so horrific that the Ottoman Empire itself tried to erase it from history. This is the story that has been deliberately buried for over 500 years. The fate of thousands of Christian nuns who fell into Ottoman hands during the empire's relentless expansion across Europe. What awaited these women of God wasn't the quick martyrdom they prayed for, but something far more sinister that would break not just their bodies, but their very souls. Today, we're uncovering the darkest secrets of Ottoman conquest, where victory meant more than just territorial expansion. For the nuns who had dedicated their lives to serving God, their capture marked the beginning of a nightmare that would make death seem like a mercy. What you're about to hear will forever change how you view the Ottoman Empire, and reveal why some fates truly are worse than death itself. From the systematic desecration of sacred vows to the elaborate rituals of humiliation designed to break the strongest faith, we'll explore how an empire turned the destruction of Christian religious life into both an art form and a weapon of psychological warfare. Before we descend into this dark chapter of religious persecution, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into the forbidden histories that shaped our world. Now, prepare yourself for a story that reveals the true cost of Ottoman expansion, paid not by soldiers on battlefields, but by the innocent women who had devoted their lives to prayer and service. The Ottoman expansion into Christian Europe during the 14th through 16th centuries wasn't merely military conquest. It was a calculated campaign of cultural and religious annihilation designed to erase Christian civilization from the territories they claimed. While history books focus on the battles and political maneuvering, the true horror of Ottoman conquest lay in what happened to the most vulnerable members of Christian society. The systematic targeting of Christian nuns wasn't accidental or opportunistic. It was a deliberate strategy that served multiple purposes within Ottoman imperial policy. These women represented the spiritual heart of Christian communities, and their destruction was designed to demoralize entire populations while demonstrating the absolute power of Islamic rule. When Ottoman forces struck Christian territories, their attacks followed a carefully planned pattern designed to maximize both physical destruction and psychological trauma. Monasteries and convents were specifically targeted not just for their wealth, but for the symbolic value of destroying Christian religious life at its most sacred level. The fate that awaited captured nuns was determined by a complex hierarchy of degradation that the Ottomans had perfected through centuries of conquest. This wasn't random violence, but a sophisticated system of religious and sexual humiliation that served specific cultural and strategic purposes within Islamic society. The initial capture was designed to be as traumatic as possible for these women who had devoted their lives to God. Nuns were often forced to watch the desecration of their sacred spaces and the murder of their sister religious before being taken captive themselves. This spiritual torture served to break their faith before the physical abuse even began. The journey to Ottoman territories was itself a nightmare that many captives didn't survive. Packed into caravans like merchandise, nuns were subjected to constant humiliation designed to strip away their religious identity. They were forced to remove their habits, compelled to eat foods forbidden by their religious practices, and made to witness acts that violated everything they held sacred. But the true horror began when they reached Ottoman cities. The fate of captured nuns was determined by their age, appearance, and the whims of their captors. Those who were young and attractive faced immediate conscription into the imperial harems, while older nuns were subjected to different but equally horrific forms of degradation. The concept of religious conversion in Ottoman society went far beyond simple change of faith. For Christian nuns, it represented a systematic destruction of identity that was designed to erase not just their beliefs, but their very sense of self. They were stripped of their religious names. Their sacred vows were mocked and violated, and any connection to their former spiritual life was systematically destroyed. The psychological warfare employed by the Ottomans was as sophisticated as it was cruel. Captured nuns were forced to participate in Islamic rituals that violated their deepest beliefs, compelled to serve in ceremonies that mocked their Christian faith, and made to witness the destruction of everything they had once held sacred. The harem system that absorbed many captured nuns was particularly horrific in its systematic degradation of women who had taken vows of chastity. These women who had dedicated their lives to spiritual purity were forced into sexual slavery that was designed not just to use their bodies, but to destroy their souls through the violation of their most sacred commitments. The legal framework of Ottoman society offered no protection for these women. Under Islamic law, Christian captives were considered property, and nuns who refused to convert faced legal penalties that included death, torture, or permanent enslavement. This legal dehumanization created an environment where the most horrific abuses could occur without any fear of consequences. The daily existence of these women was a constant cycle of religious humiliation and physical abuse. They were forced to perform tasks that violated their religious principles, compelled to participate in Islamic prayers and rituals, and subjected to constant reminders that their Christian God had abandoned them to their fate. The breeding programs implemented by Ottoman captors were particularly horrific for women who had taken vows of celibacy. Nuns were treated like livestock, forced to bear children for their Muslim masters in a deliberate violation of their sacred commitments to God. Children born from these unions were raised as Muslims, creating a new generation that would never know their mother's faith. The religious violations were the most traumatic aspect of captivity for these women of faith. They were forced to participate in Islamic ceremonies, sometimes as unwilling converts themselves. The spiritual violation was often more devastating than the physical abuse, stripping away their connection to God and their sense of divine purpose. The social hierarchy among captives created additional layers of suffering. Nuns who had been abbesses or held positions of religious authority were often singled out for special humiliation, forced to serve those who had been their spiritual inferiors in their former lives. This deliberate inversion of religious order was designed to maximize psychological trauma. The Ottoman practice of religious sharing among officials represented one of the most degrading aspects of captivity. Nuns were passed between different owners, never allowed to maintain their spiritual practices or find any sense of religious security. This constant uncertainty and abuse was designed to prevent any possibility of maintaining their Christian faith. The impact on children born to these women was devastating and deliberate. Ottoman captors used specific techniques to ensure that children would never identify with their mother's Christian heritage. They were deliberately separated from their mothers at young ages and raised to view Christianity with contempt and their enslaved parents as infidels. The economic value of these women was so high that entire Ottoman expeditions were organized specifically to capture them. The slave markets of Istanbul, Bursa, and Edirne became major centers where Christian religious women were bought and sold like livestock, with former nuns commanding premium prices due to their perceived purity and education. The psychological techniques used to break these women were sophisticated and systematic. They were subjected to sleep deprivation, forced to violate their religious dietary laws, and subjected to constant blasphemy designed to destroy their faith. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe religious trauma that made them compliant and spiritually broken. The seasonal nature of Ottoman campaigns meant that the suffering of these women followed predictable patterns. Spring campaigns would bring fresh captives who would be converted during the summer months, while winter provided time for the systematic religious indoctrination that ensured long-term compliance with Islamic rule. The religious justification for these practices was carefully constructed by Ottoman Islamic scholars and imams. The suffering of Christian nuns was presented as divine punishment for their refusal to accept Islam, with their degradation serving to demonstrate the superiority of the Islamic faith over Christianity. The impact on Ottoman society itself was profound and lasting. The normalization of extreme religious persecution created a culture where the systematic abuse of Christian religious figures was not just accepted, but celebrated as a religious duty and demonstration of Islamic superiority. The archaeological evidence from Ottoman territories paints a disturbing picture of how widespread and systematic this religious persecution was. Excavations have revealed converted churches and monasteries, specialized buildings for housing religious captives, and burial sites that suggest many nuns were killed when they could no longer serve their captors' purposes. The genetic legacy of Ottoman religious persecution can still be traced in modern DNA studies. Populations across former Ottoman territories show clear evidence of forced mixing between Christian and Muslim populations, with genetic markers telling the story of thousands of women who were torn from their religious communities and forced to bear children in Islamic households. The psychological trauma inflicted on these women was so severe that it affected not just the immediate victims but their descendants for generations. Children born into this system often suffered from what we would now recognize as complex religious trauma disorders, passed down through families that had been torn apart by religious violence. The methods used to prevent escape were as cruel as they were effective. Nuns were often deliberately marked or scarred in ways that would make them immediately identifiable if they attempted to flee, while psychological conditioning ensured that even those physically capable of escape were too spiritually broken to attempt it. The seasonal festivals of Ottoman society often featured the ritualized humiliation of Christian religious captives as entertainment. These public displays served multiple purposes. They provided amusement for the Muslim community, demonstrated the power of Islam over Christianity, and served as warnings to any Christians who might consider resistance. The trading networks that developed around the religious slave trade were vast and sophisticated. Professional traders established routes that connected Ottoman territories with markets across the Islamic world, creating an international network of religious persecution that spanned continents and lasted for centuries. The conversion ceremonies forced upon captured nuns were elaborate theatrical productions designed to maximize both the humiliation of the victims and the entertainment of Muslim audiences. These public spectacles served to demonstrate the supposed superiority of Islam while providing religious justification for the systematic abuse that followed. The educational programs implemented by Ottoman authorities were designed to erase all traces of Christian learning and replace it with Islamic doctrine. Nuns who had been scholars and teachers were forced to renounce their Christian education and submit to Islamic instruction that contradicted everything they had once believed and taught. The architectural destruction that accompanied the capture of nuns was equally systematic. Convents and monasteries were either destroyed completely or converted into mosques and Islamic schools, erasing the physical spaces where Christian religious life had flourished for centuries. The documentation of these practices was deliberately suppressed by Ottoman authorities who understood that such systematic religious persecution could damage their reputation in diplomatic relations with Christian powers. Many records were destroyed or hidden, making the full scope of the abuse difficult to document even today. The resistance shown by some nuns, despite the overwhelming odds against them, provides important examples of religious courage in the face of systematic persecution. Their stories, though largely lost to history, remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, faith can provide strength to endure unimaginable suffering. The long-term impact of Ottoman practices on European Christianity was profound and lasting. The trauma inflicted on religious communities created lasting fear and mistrust that influenced Christian-Muslim relations for centuries and contributed to the religious wars that would later devastate Europe. The decline of these practices came not from moral awakening within Ottoman society, but from practical changes in imperial policy and the growing power of European Christian states that could retaliate against Ottoman territories. The systematic persecution of Christian nuns gradually decreased as the Ottoman Empire entered its period of decline. The conversion to more moderate Islamic practices provided a religious framework that eventually condemned the most extreme forms of religious persecution, but this transformation took centuries to have any real impact. Even after official policy changes, many of the attitudes and practices that had enabled the systematic abuse of Christian religious women persisted in modified forms. The legacy of Ottoman treatment of Christian nuns serves as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for religious cruelty when faith becomes a weapon of war. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations designed to maximize spiritual suffering for strategic and ideological gain. The deliberate erasure of these stories from popular historical narratives reflects our discomfort with confronting the full horror of religious persecution in history. The romanticized image of Ottoman tolerance and multiculturalism obscures the reality that the empire was also a systematic practitioner of religious persecution and spiritual violence on an industrial scale. Modern archaeological and historical evidence continues to reveal the true scope of Ottoman impact on Christian religious communities across Europe and the Middle East. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of how systematic the religious persecution was, and how lasting its effects proved to be. The psychological techniques developed by the Ottomans for breaking the faith of Christian religious women were so effective that they influenced practices of religious persecution for centuries afterward. The methods they pioneered for destroying spiritual identity and religious resistance became templates for later systems of religious oppression. The economic impact of the religious slave trade was enormous, funding further conquests and supporting entire communities built on the systematic exploitation of Christian religious women. The wealth generated by this trade helped finance the expansion of Ottoman influence across Europe and the Mediterranean. The social structures that enabled these practices reveal important insights into how entire societies can normalize extreme religious cruelty when it serves their ideological and strategic interests. The Ottomans weren't monsters. They were people who had created a culture that rewarded the systematic persecution of those who held different religious beliefs. As we examine these dark chapters of religious history, we must confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and the capacity for cruelty that exists when religious differences become justifications for systematic abuse. The Ottoman treatment of Christian nuns reminds us that religious faith can be both a source of strength and a target for those who seek to destroy the human spirit. The women who suffered under Ottoman religious persecution deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings whose faith and dedication had value beyond their utility to their captors. Their stories, though painful to hear, are an essential part of understanding the true cost of religious warfare and the price paid by those who choose to maintain their beliefs in the face of systematic persecution. The systematic nature of Ottoman religious abuse reveals how quickly societies can develop sophisticated methods of spiritual destruction when it serves their ideological interests. The techniques they used to break the faith of Christian nuns were not the products of individual fanaticism, but of cultural systems that had evolved to maximize the extraction of religious submission from spiritual suffering. Today, as we study these historical horrors, we honor the memory of those who suffered by ensuring that their stories are told and their faith acknowledged. The Christian nuns who faced fates worse than death deserve to have their spiritual courage recognized as part of the historical record of religious persecution and human resilience. The legacy of Ottoman treatment of Christian religious women serves as a warning about the dangers of religious extremism and the ease with which societies can slip into systematic spiritual cruelty. By understanding these dark chapters of our past, we can better recognize and resist similar patterns of religious persecution in our own time. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new details about the scope and systematic nature of Ottoman religious persecution of Christian nuns. Each discovery adds to our understanding of how widespread these practices were, and how deeply they were embedded in Ottoman culture and Islamic ideology of the period. As we conclude this examination of one of history's darkest chapters of religious persecution, we must remember that behind every statistic was a real person. A nun torn from her convent, a woman of faith separated from her religious community, a servant of God whose life was destroyed by forces that sought to erase her very soul. Their stories deserve to be told, not to sensationalize their suffering, but to honor their memory and ensure that such religious horrors are never forgotten or repeated.